It has been an important week in the battle for the Republican Party's soul, as the party continues looking for its path out of the political wilderness, its path out of the political minority. Frankly, voices of immoderation in the party had a pretty good week. The Tea Parties featured a lot of mainstream Republican figures alongside the abolish the Federal Reserve folks and people with messages like this. Yeah, the Obama was not born in the United States and thus is not actually even really the president. Conspiracy theorists are teabaggers too. And then, of course, Texas Governor Rick Perry found the teabagging Tea Party events this week to be a good time and place to talk about the possibility of his state maybe seceding from the Union. Also this week, Alaska Governor Sarah Palin made an out-of-Alaska star turn back into the national Republican spotlight with an appearance at a big anti-abortion event in Indiana, putting that classic culture war issue squarely back at the forefront of the Republican leadership race. At that event, RNC Chair Michael Steele ticked off a list of the party's standard bearers that included Palin, as well as South Carolina Governor Mark turn-down-the-stimulus money Sanford. As the nation tries to discern whether the new post-George Bush, post-John McCain Republican Party is going to become a more moderate centrist party, or whether it is going to tack hard right, as many of its ardent activists hope it will, keep in mind that it was only earlier this month that Republican Representative Spencer Bachus insisted that he had a list of 17 secret socialists in the U.S. House of Representatives. His Republican colleague Michelle Bachmann, with her increasingly high national figure, also this month went public with her concern that President Obama has plans to establish re-education camps for young people. Add those items to this week's developments, and we may officially have a trend toward the immoderate in the out-of-power Republican Party. In political science terms, this is not unprecedented. In fact, the way most Republicans understand their own history, they were most significantly led out of the wilderness in the past by Ronald Reagan, who was originally seen as a conservative movement figure, some considered too far right to be accepted by the mainstream of the party, let alone the mainstream of the country. So if past is prologue, does that mean we're in for a Palin revolution? Joining us now, a man who knows more about that particular piece of political history than just about anyone, James Mann, author of the book, The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan. Mr. Mann, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Good to be with you, Rachel.
Do you see parallels between what the Republican Party is facing now and what it faced previously in terms of the time that Ronald Reagan rose to power and when he was at his apex?
Reagan rose to power in the 1970s. The Republicans had already been in the wilderness for a good 10 years, ever since Barry Goldwater's landslide defeat in 1964. I think the Republicans now are about where they were in 1964, which is they've got a good several years at least in the wilderness before anybody leads them out. And I don't see someone like Palin as being able to put together the coalition of different right-wing groups that Reagan put together.
Who were the members, the important members of those coalition, and why did it take Reagan to put them together?
Well, Reagan really put together a coalition of social conservatives, people who were opposed to abortion, for example, of economic conservatives, people who wanted their taxes cut, and of foreign policy hawks. And Reagan managed to stitch together this coalition and persuade everybody that they would, each of these factions, they would get something from his presidency. But there was nothing really inherently unifying about these groups. You can imagine someone who's in favor of lower taxes who may have a position one way or another on abortion. Reagan held it together, but it's fallen apart in the last few years, and I can't see who's going to stitch it together.
One of the things that's important, I think, about the modern legacy of Ronald Reagan is that Republicans and conservative movement activists in particular think of him as somebody who was able to make the Republican Party mainstream while still holding on to conservative principles in an almost purist fashion. That's the way that he's seen looking back on him now. When you study his contemporaneous political decisions, does it seem like that's what he was trying to do at the time?
In fact, the thrust of my book, The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan, is that Reagan, particularly in his final years in office, his last 3 or 4 years, was very different from his image. Conservatives forget how much they not only were against, but severely criticized Reagan. There are quotes in there in my book from conservative leaders who called Reagan. There was one quote from a guy named Howard Phillips. Reagan was a useful idiot for Soviet propaganda. That was the view at the time. But conservatives now forget what they were saying because Reagan moved in ways that they didn't like.
When you think about the difference between the way that he actually governed, the way that he behaved, and as you say, the way that he was treated by conservatives at that time, and the way that he is remembered now, why do you think there is this amnesia? Why do you think that criticism has been forgotten? And what might that say about how the legacy of Reagan continues to influence the decisions that conservatives make now?
Yeah, I've been surprised. I couldn't have predicted before my book came out. Conservatives can't deal with a dispassionate view of Reagan, which shows that he doesn't fit this image. And I think the reason is because Reagan is one of the few unifying forces that they have with all these different groups, that there's a kind of that nostalgia is an effort to stitch together these different groups. So, you know, by maintaining this nostalgic view of Reagan, they're really lost in the past, I think.
James Mann, author of The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan, A History of the End of the Cold War. Thanks so much for your time tonight. It's nice to see you.